Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, right now, many Indigenous communities in Canada are in pain. They are in pain because over the past few weeks, a few Indigenous folks have gone to the sites of former boarding schools in which many Indigenous children have been taken to be culturally assimilated. And these boarding schools are run by the Catholic Church. And they have used metal detectors to find the remains of so many children. And this has unearthed a wound that is already deeply seated in the minds and hearts of many Indigenous people in Canada. And this pain has caused many things to happen. And one of the things that I suspect this pain has caused to happen is the destruction of various churches on Indigenous land in Canada and elsewhere. Since June 21st, my friends, over 10 churches exactly have been put on fire. 5 or so of which have been completely and utterly destroyed, the others which have just been damaged. And of course, there's no hardcore evidence that Indigenous people are behind this. But there are suspicions, and there are suspicions because right after the information was released about this mass gravesite of kids who were buried in unmarked areas, churches began burning down. So there's sort of a correlation between the two events, but again, we don't have any hardcore evidence. But what is more telling than the destruction of the churches is how the Lower Similkameen band of chiefs responded to the destruction of a Catholic church on their territory. They said, and I quote, "This is a symptom of the intergenerational trauma our survivors and intergenerational descendants are experiencing. There are supports to help deal with these emotions in a more healing way." This was their response to the 4 churches that had burned in that week in June, the very end of June. So this is not even Christian Watson saying that the Indigenous folks are doing this. This is the Lower Similkameen band of chiefs suggesting that these fires may have indeed been started by Indigenous people. And so let me say before I say anything else, the Catholic Church and any other religious institution which ran these schools and which were responsible in the torture these kids received, they need to be held accountable for this. These children should not have to die in vain. And the pain and suffering that these children went through should not be forgotten by history. What happened to these children in Canada trying to be culturally assimilated, being taught terrible things about themselves, is never okay, and it's never acceptable. However, the justifications for the burning and the continued grievances that so many Indigenous people in Canada have are equally feeble, facile, and are not okay. This statement got me in trouble on Twitter when I said without equivocation that burning churches and destroying property is no way to make amends for the mistakes of the past, and pretending as if you have been personally hurt and you have been personally affected by the sins of the past is also no justification for bad behavior. When I said this, my friends, my Twitter inbox was full of dissent, derision, and vitriol from people who were saying that I was being insensitive and that I did not understand the plight of Indigenous folks and that I was denying the existence of intergenerational trauma. Now notice, intergenerational trauma was a term used by the tribal elders to explain, semi-justify the destruction of these churches. And intergenerational trauma was one of the excuses that many folks in my Twitter mentions used to justify the destruction of property. They're saying that property is not as important as life is. We'll get to that in a moment. So this idea of intergenerational trauma being used as a crutch to justify bad behavior, or just being used in general to justify feeling certain ways, is in my opinion a weak idea. So, according to the American Psychological Association, which defines intergenerational trauma as sort of the idea that past cultural tragedies can and do impact generations who are adjacent to them, either by identity, geography, or whatever other factor. So, for example, an example of intergenerational trauma would be this: an Indigenous person in 2021 feeling the effects of Indigenous kids in 1975 being put into school and being, tortured by, cultural assimilationist tactics. The intergenerational trauma says that the person in 2021, regardless of if they were actually present for the event, still suffers from the trauma of that event, or still suffers from the impacts of the trauma of that event. The APA article on this says this: that 2 large-scale national surveys from the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey and the Aboriginal Peoples Survey found that children, and in some cases grandchildren of those who attended the schools, of people of the assimilationist schools, were more likely to report psychological distress and suicide attempts, to have learning disabilities and problems in school, and to contract hepatitis C through drug use than controls whose parents had not been added to such school. So there's a sort of correlation between the atrocities of the past and bad actions in the future. But the problem with justifying or explaining these bad actions through intergenerational trauma is that it leaves out the primacy of the human will. As bad as it was for those kids to have been tortured in those schools with these culturally assimilationist whatever, as bad as that was, that does not necessitate someone to undertake destructive behavior. That does not necessitate someone to try to hurt themselves. It may cause you a sense of pain. Whenever I see a video of a guy being lynched that I would go in one of these museums and see, I cry. But it's not because the guy was black and I'm black and we had the same. No. It's because another human being is at stake. But I can also decide what I will do other than crying. I can decide that I'm not going to let that be a idea of what I am right now. I can decide that that was at a point in time where conditions were different and that we have come so far. The way we interpret information, my friends, is so radically different and so multifaceted. To suggest that we all receive information the same way is a fallacy. And yet intergenerational trauma seems to suggest there is a primary way that people interpret or must interpret information that hurts them. But there are also other reasons as to why I think the idea of intergenerational trauma is bad. Number one, time moves in one direction. The further someone is from a particular occurrence limits the immoral stake they can make. Now, so many people are trying to justify the burning of churches because of the terror Indigenous folks endured many years ago. But guess what? When you are so far from a situation, your moral claim is lessened, because if you're going to have a moral claim, you must actually have had a physical stake. What do I mean by this? So, for example, if let's say someone had a father and their father got shot in the head. Now, obviously, this is a horrific, tragic event. However, does this then justify the person whose father got shot in the head to go ahead and shoot that other person in the head when they have already committed the crime? Let's say that the person's father got shot in the head 20 years ago. Obviously, if the father had survived that occurrence, the father would have a different set of responses that we just justified for him than a person 20 years ago who was a descendant of his. If the father had got shot in the head but still was alive, had consciousness, and had a gun at his disposal, he would be able to shoot that other person in the immediate defense of his life. But if someone 20 years ago goes back to the person who shot the father and tries to kill him randomly outside of the context of a crime being committed, that would then be unjust. What's my point? My point is, if you're going to make a moral claim, you have to have an inherent involvement with it. Being proximal to a moral claim does not necessarily mean you're involved. It may mean that it may impact you or you may interpret it in a certain way, but it doesn't mean you're involved. Intergenerational trauma makes the pains of the past real in the present without justifying why they should be so. Also, trauma is no substitute for ethical reasoning. Ethics, my friends, exist independent of our being, independent of our subjective intuitions. Ethics exist in the observable, objective world. We can discern if things are right or wrong by how much they impact the harmonization of certain things. We can discern that going ahead and killing someone is wrong because it impacts the harmonization of their being, especially without just cause. We can discern that going ahead and burning down someone's house is wrong because it impacts the harmony of their being, their right in society. We can discern these things without needing to have our own subjective experiences tell us. Nature is a descriptive entity that gives us certain reasons as to why things are right and wrong. Nature tells us, hey, human beings have value, we have rationality, we can understand things and think, and even if we can't, we have the capacity still, and that kind of gives us the ability to discern who has rights and who doesn't have rights. But to make trauma a substitute for ethics is to take universal principles, root them to the conditional, and base them upon the fickleness of human appetites. If you have an ethical system based upon the fickleness of human appetites, i.e. utilitarianism, you don't have a stable ethical ground, and you don't have justification for the ethical decisions beyond how people feel, or how it may impact them in that particular place. What is important and what is objective can be observed and found in the world. Trauma is no substitute for that. So, for example, your trauma does not give you the right to violate someone else's right to property, because someone else's property is actually their life. Property is conceptualized first principles as someone's ability to own and govern their life. It's not merely a physical, tangible item, although it becomes that, as Locke said in the Secretaries of Government, when people mix their genius, mix their labor with the earth, it becomes that, but we are ultimately all self-owning individuals. That's where the principle of property comes. When you harm my property, you harm my life, and that is wrong because you're violating my rights. That's true ethics. Trauma is a temporary feeling, a fleeting feeling that is subjective and conditional, whereas property rights are objective and universal. And number 3, knowledge, my friends, is not solely contained in one individual experience. It is obtained through observation, and observation requires all of us to escape our own experience. This is the idea of standpoint epistemology, that indigenous people have a different interaction with knowledge in the world because of certain structures and institutions that have impacted them. But the problem with this is the structures and institutions that may have impacted them, number one, it's not necessarily entirely clear as to why those same structures and institutions must shape the life or the thinking of an indigenous person today, just because they did in the past. And number two, it suggests that what is more important is to look at what has impacted you, what has happened at a particular point in time, rather than looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that we have to go outside of ourselves, and we must go outside of our own experiences to obtain knowledge. If this was not true, human beings would not have the need to grow or to acquire skills. You have to acquire skills, and part of acquiring skills is going outside of what your own experience is. When someone, for example, has to go out and survive in the woods for a week, and let's say they've just been in a very comfortable corporate environment for their entire life, well, part of them gaining knowledge about how to survive in the woods for a week is going to require them to escape their experience, interact with the objective, tangible world, and then what? Develop methods to survive. But when we stay in our own experiences and we stay bogged down in the subjective minutia of our own desires and sensibilities, we miss the actual world. My friends, to blame all your problems on intergenerational trauma not only destroys the will, it makes you miss the actual world. There is a beautiful, dynamic, complex, objective world out there that you can interact with, that you can impact by understanding it. Don't limit yourself to a tragedy. Don't limit yourself to an emotion. Don't limit yourself to a condition. Transcend. Be better. But the problem is, so many folks expect indigenous people to remain hurt and expect them to do certain things because of injustices of the past. I don't. Because I recognize that the human being is more than a circumstance. The human being is an eternal sentiment that keeps perpetuating and perpetuating and perpetuating until our universe goes away. We are more than any period of time, my friends. So to my indigenous brothers and sisters, know this, I love you. I want you to be all right. But you have to take responsibility for your own actions. And you have to stop letting what people did to you in the past define you in the present. And you have to understand, you got a fire within you that burns brighter than any attempt that has tried to subjugate you in the past. And you have to understand this as well. You're not merely an Indigenous person. You're an individual with all the complexities and multitudes that an individual contains therein their being. I love you. Love yourself, okay? Think on it. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, please support me at patreon.com/PhilCWatson or PayPal, official cwatson@gmail.com, or Discord, which is in the link down below, or locals, christianwatson.locals.com. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.